So thanks for the opportunity to come and present some of my work. I'm a new assistant professor at the University of Calgary. I'm in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, but I also have a 60% secondment to the School of Public Policy. So my work is really focused between the two. I'm actually a physicist by training. I used to do experimental quantum optics, what feels like a very long time ago. And then I worked for a number of years as a management consultant with McKinsey, working on energy and climate issues. And then I was at the Pembina Institute, which is a Alberta and Canadian-based clean energy think tank. And so now I've come back into academia, trying to combine sort of these different experiences. And so that really reflects or is reflected in the work that I'm doing in this kind of connecting modeling to policy design. So I thought I would start just really quickly before I get into the research that I wanted to share, introducing, for those that aren't aware of it, this concept of this field of macro energy systems, which is an area that I identify with and is a really sort of emerging discipline. And what it is that it's really an area that looks to focus on the long-term and systems level aspects of energy systems and trying to combine specifically kind of quantitative analysis and modeling, but with a more holistic understanding of systems in question. And so doing so, really trying to combine, physical science and engineering, but also environmental science and finance and economics all together in this really, inherently transdisciplinary way. So when I thought about what to talk about today and spoke a little bit with Jules and others, decided to really cover sort of three distinct topics that I think are knitted together by this sort of thread of how understanding dynamics of energy transitions can enable better policy designs and outcomes. And so the three things that I wanted to focus on today, one is some work that I've done looking at the influence of incumbent industries on climate and innovation policy. So how the power that they wield, and in particular, political power, sets constraints over the setting of missions. The second is around the way that existing infrastructure constrains or creates opportunity in transition. And that's some work that's looking at the potential for coal to gas switching, how much of it is consistent with different climate targets, and then also looking at how the infrastructure and pipeline infrastructure does or doesn't allow that to happen in different regions. And then the final piece is really just sort of more of a brief introduction to some concepts around the mid-transition and some work that is underway now thinking about infrastructure related to internal combustion engine vehicle operation and what might happen under contraction of that sector. So the first piece around this question of incumbent power really comes out of some case study work that I did looking at the history of the development of the oil sands in Alberta, and in particular, the development of the in situ technology to produce the oil sands, the majority of the oil sands resource that cannot be mined. And so I went into this work really with an interest to understand kind of the role of government and how important government's role was or wasn't. But one of the things that came out sort of inspired this other line of thinking around how does an incumbent industry actually impact the way that different missions are set. And in this case, it was the way that the decision of the Lougheed government to go ahead with development of that technology. So I'll share a little bit about the case study itself and then kind of situate that within this broader context of different types of missions. But come back to the case study. So basically, this is a very abbreviated timeline of the history of the development of the oil sands resource in Alberta. So you have the first mining of bitumen demonstrated really towards the beginning of the century, or the last century, and that runs all the way up up to the 80s when you had the SAGD, the technology for the in situ development demonstrated. And so I think one of the things that's important to recognize in this history is that up until the 1970s, the oil industry in Alberta was predominantly a conventional oil industry. So, the conventional production of oil from wells started in really the in the 40s with the oil well that was drilled in Leduc, and then during that period from 1947 to 1972, you actually had a case where the conventional oil industry, which was the dominant industry in the province, really viewed the oil sands resource as a threat, right, and a potential competitor. And in particular, one of the sort of pinch points there was really the infrastructure for exports. So nothing is new, I guess, in history in what we experience now, but there was a constraint in the amount of export capacity that the province had, and so the potential that the oil sands resource would get developed was really a threat to the ability of the conventional industry to export their product. Not to mention, there would be competition over labor and investment and so forth. And so what you had through that period up to the 70s was a series of actions that were taken by the government to really protect the conventional industry. There was hard limits placed on the amount of oil that could be produced from the oil sands, specifically to avoid that competition. There was originally before the 60s, it was a pro-rationing, so you were only allowed to produce a certain percentage of what any given project could produce. So a well would be limited to some percentage, and similarly an oil sands facility would be limited to some percentage, and that effectively made it almost impossible to develop any oil sands facilities because they wouldn't be economic when running under this pro-rationing. And so it was really only when in the 70s that there was the start of this conventional resource decline. That is, you had more production from the existing wells than you had finding of new resources, that really shifted. And you saw that in terms of the what the conventional oil industry did in their in their lobbying efforts and their sort of alignment. They basically in the 70s, after that, after they reached that point where the resource was in decline, they said that they would stop advocating against development of oil sands resource, but they still didn't completely embrace the new technology. And in fact, while the Lougheed government, undertook AOSTRA and made this big mission, mission type innovation to develop the oil sands, the conventional industry was lobbying very heavily to have enhanced oil recovery be the focus of that investment. So basically being able to produce more out of the existing wells that they owned, and that obviously ties very directly to their operations at that time. But you had with Lougheed a government that was, didn't have very close ties to the conventional resource and had some, maybe loose ties even to some of the oil sands facilities or oil sands companies, those involved in the production, for example. And so there was the decision made to actually go ahead with AOSTRA with this mission to be able to develop the oil sands resource rather than, a major investment in the conventional wells. And that ultimately, there's much more to the story, but for the purposes here, I think that is that decision and that investment that's important. And so the way that I would propose to understand this is really thinking about how incumbents respond to different potential disruptive technology based on the impact of that technology on their own operations. And so I think this is really important and relevant because of all of the calls, obviously for things like Manhattan Project or Moonshot-like projects for decarbonization. But I think that in combining some of the theories of carbon lock-in, and in particular the political mechanism of power and carbon lock-in, with the way that missions are created, one finds that it may not be possible to actually create missions like a Manhattan Project or a moonshot that disrupt a local industry. And obviously, the decarbonization mission, although there may be opportunities for some continued operation and production of fossil fuels, there is clearly the need for a dramatic contraction, and all of the different pathways to net zero show a dramatic contraction in production of oil globally. And so that is sort of inherently at odds with the interests of an incumbent oil industry in a region like Alberta. And so I think one way to understand this is by looking at what is the impact of a disruption on an incumbent industry. And so disruption, obviously by definition, is disruptive, but who is being disrupted and how that disruption impacts the incumbents can vary wildly. And I think there's the spectrum from, at the one end of the spectrum, you have something that's new, creates a new market. And so if you think about the Manhattan Project or the moonshot, those are, sort of very special types of disruptions, because there you really are creating a new market, but you have this one central buyer as the government. But there's actually examples that are sort of a little bit more mundane, like the development of new classes of drugs. So drugs that treat new types of, or drugs that treat not new types of issues, but that treat issues in a drug-based way, in a way that has not been possible before. And in all of these examples, they're actually either creating entirely new markets. In the case of the moonshot, you now have a market for going to the moon you didn't have before. But for example, with the development of new drug classes, you're actually those drugs increase the total sales in pharmaceuticals without cannibalizing sales in any other areas of drugs. And so these are projects that are very potentially attractive to an incumbent, because it's really just creating a new market. It's increasing the size of the pie. In the middle, you have something that's a little bit more nuanced, where you have disruptions that compete with existing products and services, but in a way that doesn't necessarily harm the incumbents, and in some cases can actually benefit them compared to if that innovation hadn't happened. And so some examples there would be, agricultural innovation for crop yields, or existing drug class development, where you have drugs, for example, that are going to be out of patent. And so a new drug, it might cannibalize the sale of an old drug, but if that older drug is going to be out of a patent protection, then that is no longer a secure market share for this incumbent anymore anyway. Whereas if they are able to create a new drug that sort of overlaps with that area, they're able to recapture and secure some of that market share. You also have examples like Sematech, which was the effort by the US to develop out the semiconductor industry and really to take market share away from Japan in the 80s, where that clearly is a threat to an incumbent, but it's the US government and the incumbent is in Japan. So there's no direct tie there. And then you have this third category that I would call incumbent threatening. So that's basically, disruptions that are directly going to address or going to hurt the market, potentially hurt the market share or reduce the market share for an incumbent. And again, I think that, disruption that enables climate action fits in this area when we think about incumbents in the oil sector. And there, I think one doesn't find, or at least I haven't found, examples that fit in that category. And so that, I think, brings to mind some questions around these calls for, or the challenges of creating really a disruption and an AOSTRA-like project that actually is going to, fundamentally reduce demand for oil and gas. And so what it then suggests instead is, with some of the questions around innovation, we have to find ways to shift the the policies that we're trying to, or the disruptions that we're trying to go after from this incumbent threatening category to, potentially the market rewarding category. And so thinking about, ways that you can find links to the incumbents, where they can be beneficiaries of the innovation is one. Obviously I think that's a big part of what we see happening with the hydrogen example in Alberta. But I think one has to approach it, with some caution about how much should, go into that category. The second issue around external factors reducing that market, the case in the climate case would be where you have incumbents that really see climate action and in particular demand side climate action threatening market share anyway. And so there's more of a motivation to, make, say, a bigger shift to somewhere else. And then the third piece is that regional piece. And that's something that I think is very relevant, within a country, whether it's Canada or Germany, thinking about how a federal government, for example, might be better placed to implement some of these innovation policies if it's going to disrupt incumbents, but only in, one specific province. And there might be more of a disconnect there. So shifting gears to another question around the dynamics of energy transition. This is related to this question of, we imagine a future net zero world in 2050, but we're constrained, obviously, to some extent by the infrastructure that exists today. Certainly, in some cases, directly constrained, but also potentially things are, at least easier to do if they can leverage some kind of existing infrastructure we have. And so, for this example, oops, I lost my here. Okay. So this is some work that I have done with Arvind Ravikumar and Lydia Yang, looking at what is the potential for LNG to reduce carbon emissions. This is also obviously a very live discussion within Canada, and the question of what potential there is to expand LNG exports. So, on the one hand, and proponents for the case for expansion of LNG point out that coal to gas switching in the power sector, particularly if upstream emissions are addressed, can reduce global carbon emissions. And we've seen that here, well, in the US historically, and actually here in Alberta just over the past few years, as we have a number of coal plants that are switching to gas, there is a reduction in the interim. The question, though, is, to what extent and under what conditions is this claim true? What risks are there, and how feasible is this? So, is it actually true? And to what extent does LNG actually replace coal versus create, new potential demand via new gas plants? What is the runway here? And so for how, what period of time over which are these plants going to operate? Because we know ultimately, again, in light of the net zero goal, we need to get to, we need to phase out ultimately even these gas plants. And then finally, what is that feasibility of coal to gas switching? So one of the big constraints on coal to gas switching is the availability of gas infrastructure, both from a cost perspective. So if you have sources of gas available, that makes the switching costs much lower, but also again, from this question of what is a potential risk of locking in gas through the construction of new infrastructure with some kind of long lifetime. So in order to answer this question, we looked at what is the export and import terminal existing infrastructure, as well as planned infrastructure. And so you see that there is, certainly plans for a major expansion. The export terminals are somewhat newer than import terminals, but there is the potential for there to be significant growth. And so there's a question of, how does this growth potentially impact emissions, not just, in the period shortly after it's constructed, but in the 2030 and years from today. And so in order to do so, we looked at, from the input sides, basically the emissions intensity of the LNG value chain. So I think starting from the upstream all the way to the end use. We have the LNG project database that was constructed in this work. And then we used the 1.5, 2, and 3 degree targets and the IPCC's pathways there to understand what would be under these different targets and pathways, what would be the net production from coal that would be expected, what is the electricity that's being produced from natural gas, and those emissions associated. And so with those inputs, taking the LNG life cycle emissions intensity and the additional emissions from new LNG projects, and then looking at what is the potential basically to substitute coal for gas. So are there coal plants that are expected to be operating or not? And then based on the amount of substitution that you're doing, what is the climate impact of adding this LNG? Are we actually reducing emissions because we are switching away from coal, or are we increasing emissions because we're adding, potentially new generation? And so the first way to answer this question is to look at what happens to the global power sector emissions here over time, compared to, and the black line is the IPCC sort of baseline trajectory for 1.5 degrees. And perhaps unsurprisingly, you find that obviously it depends on how much substitution you're doing. So in this orange line, this is a case of no substitution. So if this new LNG that's coming online is not actually being used in coal to gas switching, but just in new gas plants, that obviously is going to increase emissions. In the best case, you would have 100% substitution. So the LNG is all going to reduce coal generation. And there you find that in the near term, up to 2030, there is a reduction in the global power sector emissions as you are able to reduce coal generation in that near term. But that does plateau, at around 2030, and by late 2030, so 2038, there's actually an increase in emissions in the case where you have this LNG over the case where you don't. And so that shows that, on this sort of 1.5, if we are on a 1.5 trajectory, then LNG has some role to play in the near term, but after a certain point, it actually is going to increase emissions. And the reason for that is basically that and the reason that you have that 2030 timeline there is that if you look at the what we call the surplus coal-based power generation, so what kind of coal there is actually generating under this scenario by 2030, in this base case of the 1.5 degrees, all of the coal generation has already been retired or substituted. And so there's no more potential substitution. And so you're not getting any more benefits from your additional LNG after 2030. And by 2038, you've actually eroded all of the emissions benefits that you had. So that really sort of, I think, shows the two extremes, right? So if you were sort of to do the very best under this 1.5 degrees, you could see LNG playing a role. But of course, the question is, what if we're not on a 1.5 degree trajectory? And so we can do the same, ask the same questions for different IPCC trajectories. So a 3 degree, a 2 degree, and then this is the 1.5 that we had before. And what we find is that in the 2 degree trajectory, so again, if we're in a world where we're on a path to get to 2 degrees, there we have a little bit more runway for LNG, and out to 2035, these LNG plants are still contributing to emissions reductions, or LNG exports, excuse me, are still contributing to emission reductions through the ability to substitute for coal. But again, after that point, after 2038, you start to erode those emission benefits. In contrast, in a world where we are on track to a 3 degree emissions reductions, basically we're running a lot more coal plants than in those other worlds. There is the potential for LNG to contribute. And so I think what this is showing is that if you go back to the original question of, is LNG effective? Is it a climate, a positive climate action to expand LNG? And the answer is that it depends on where we are at on an emissions trajectory, basically, and whether we have, through a bunch of other actions, really put ourselves on a 2-degree or 1.5-degree path, in which case there is potentially a role for LNG, but it is relatively short, compared to the timeline of LNG infrastructure. If we are on a 3-degree world, though, there is potentially, a role that LNG can start to play. And this then, I think, ties back to some real policy questions of, I would frame this as basically, you could then treat LNG infrastructure as some sort of insurance against a potential lack of global climate action. And in that case, the risk of stranded assets really, you can think about those almost like the cost of the insurance. But the LNG would need to be, the construction and approval of the LNG facilities would really need to take into account that kind of treatment of the infrastructure, right? And so, if it is more of an insurance, then the question is, what happens to any benefits that are or any profits that are made during that period up to the point when we find out if it was insurance or not, right? Up to the 2030 or 2038, and how can we ensure that those profits are really able to be used to kind of pay the cost of the insurance, if you want, to deal with the stranded assets, so that those actually are retired at that point, if that is the kind of what's needed from a climate perspective, versus continue to operate and actually increase emissions. And so then it becomes really, I think what this shows is that there is a bit of a, really policy question that's really important and needed, given this sort of differential impact depending which trajectory that you're actually on. Now the question, so this was sort of, that first step is basically assuming that you could just switch all the coal plants to gas as long as you have the LNG available. But there is this additional constraint, which is the availability of infrastructure. And so to look at that, we've constructed basically a set of all of the coal plants in the world, which are these blue triangles. And then in the orange, you have the natural gas existing pipelines. And so I think one of the things that, just from the map itself, you can see obviously is that in the US and Canada, you have quite a lot of infrastructure that is close to the existing, or you have quite a lot of coal plants that are close to these existing pipelines. You have case in Africa and South America, where you have, a number of coal plants and very, very little natural gas infrastructure. And then the similar, sort of at glance, I guess maybe one can kind of see that case for India, but I'll get into some more analysis behind that. But basically now we're sort of trying to ask, okay, what is the haircut on the potential coal plant availability for switching based on access to infrastructure, both in terms of, that being economic to actually do, but also wanting to try to avoid a build out of a bunch of natural gas infrastructure that could lock in future emissions. And so if you look at the global coal capacity and the distance to the pipelines, we have a plot of the cumulative capacity as a function of that distance. There's not a hard and fast rule of how close plants have to be to a gas pipeline to be convertible. But what we did look at was the median distance of the US cases, which we found to be 14 kilometers. And if you use that as a sort of one kind of data point or one metric, then we find that the majority, so about 60% of global coal capacity, is at least that far or further from a gas pipeline. And you have sort of, obviously some plants that are, some small tail of plants that are, very close. They're basically co-located today, but a relatively significant amount of plants that are really quite far from pipelines, where you would say, well, it's going to be very hard to make the case for a conversion here. Of course, you can do a substitution where you build an entirely new plant somewhere, but that's problematic in two ways. One, the case again for coal to gas conversion is also the potential to reuse existing infrastructure and have a plant with a shorter lifetime. And so if you're building a new plant, that's not possible. But of course, also if you're needing to build a new plant somewhere else, then you need to think about whether you actually have transmission infrastructure there that's available. And so then we looked at and quantified that regional variation. So for some different countries and then the different regions of the world, we looked at the distance of the coal plants to the gas pipelines, and the width of the sort of violin plot here is the capacity of coal plants in that at that point. And so you see that, for example, in Canada and the US, you have really a significant amount of capacity that is at or closer to the pipeline than this 14 kilometers. You have in China also, a fairly significant amount, but for example, in India, you have much more that is, sort of just at that distance or further. And similarly, also, in Africa, also quite a lot of capacity that's further away. And so what I think that, what that says is that this question of coming back to the LNG availability, you're not going to necessarily be able to switch all these coal plants that are available. But also when we think about coal to gas switching, we have to think very differently about the potential to do so. And I think there's a tendency to say, this has worked arguably well to some extent in Canada and the US in some cases, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be able to be easily repeated in other jurisdictions because of that distance. Now, there's obviously a few caveats here, and we focused in this analysis exclusively on the power sector. And natural gas is used also within the industrial sector for building heating as well. And in both of those cases, there's a potential to substitute for coal that's used today in the industrial sector and in building heating with natural gas. And so, the potential for, or this, this potential haircut and the potential availability of coal plants to substitute for gas, and the way that just going back to here, the way that gives you at 2030 in the 1.5 degree scenario, you have no more coal plants left. It is possible that you might have industrial uses of coal or uses of coal in building heating. And so, a next step here would be to say, okay, so this is what it looks like for the power sector. Now you want to actually do something similar where you have an assessment of the use of coal for these other purposes. But I think that this is still, helpful, at least or still give some information for the piece of the question around, well, in the power sector, and if we're planning for importing of LNG and the use of LNG in the power sector, how much LNG do we actually need to be able to fulfill that piece? And so that, this is a small part of the bigger question of the LNG, but it is one that I think is really quite related to where that discussion is today. So, one kind of last piece to this puzzle that is sort of actually also overlapping to some extent with the other two is really related to this question of kind of the mid-transition and the dynamics, particularly within that mid-transition of contraction of existing energy systems. And so in this case, it's the internal combustion engine infrastructure that we're interested in. As I mentioned, this is sort of some new work, so I don't have results to share of it yet, but I wanted to at least share some of the thinking behind it, as well as some of the thinking around kind of this mid-transition and more questions that arise there. So along with Emily Grubert, we recently published this paper thinking about, a midterm future of the energy transition. And again, I think often in a lot of the energy modeling, there is a big focus on the, the system today and the end state. But there is, I think, we're entering into actually a period now that we're talking about in this concept of the mid-transition, and it's basically meant to describe this medium-term future. So I think it's a time that will extend at least 10 years, but for some systems, potentially 20, 25 years, where you have both the conventional fossil-based energy system, but then you also have your new net zero carbon energy system. But importantly, and what I think defines this medium term or this mid-transition as opposed to sort of being on the either ends, is when actually each system imposes some kind of operational constraints on the other. And so, again, I think the power sector is a really good example where this is illustrated. So, the conventional fossil-based energy system in the power sector is designed to operate in some way. You have these large centralized plants. They are relatively controllable and they can respond to sort of whatever kind of demand is given on the demand side. When you think about, a highly decarbonized or net zero electricity system, you have something that looks very different with much more distributed generation. You have a much more control on the demand side. And those two things are fundamentally, very different in a way. But when the two are operating together, you're going to have some complex dynamics where you have times where you are operating more in your sort of conventional fossil-based paradigm, and times more in the zero carbon paradigm, and those may start to arise. I think we're starting to see in a number of regions that are actually having periods where they're operating their system at very, very high. California had some hours where they had something like 97% renewable energy generation during the course of a day. And so you're sort of flipping back and forth between these two systems. And that is going to cause issues or sort of create new dynamics around, the zero carbon energy system creating ramping constraints on the fossil system, or questions of the way that that the economics of the systems operate when you have significant times at this sort of lower cost energy. And so one of the things that we think is important is that there actually need to be new sort of technical heuristics and metrics that are supporting decision making, right? And so some of the things, for example, like the levelized cost of electricity is a very useful metric for a fossil-based energy system. As you start to kind of have a more dominant zero carbon energy system where you might have lower energy costs but higher capacity costs, that becomes a somewhat less useful. I think one of the other things that we observe is that there's actually typically in modeling a lot less attention paid to kind of the phase out versus the phase in terms of what needs to be built. Gets more attention that sort of what happens with that with the contraction. And moreover, are often in some assumptions that systems will contract in a very linear way, and that they will, meaning that they will, get smaller, but that they will stay around in that smaller state for, essentially always. And that may or may not be the case, and that imposes constraints on the new system. As well as, I think there is an opportunity to bring in more of the role of governance and institutional structures in these modelings, which is not necessarily unique to, the mid-transition, but again, just kind of coming back to this question of how to go beyond, purely the quantitative constraint. So the example that I'm working on in this space is looking at the contraction of internal combustion vehicle infrastructure and the potential impact on the ability to operate these vehicles. And so, I think we're all familiar with the challenges that electric vehicles have faced, the deployment and access to charging infrastructure. I would argue that this is actually starting to be more addressed and less of a concern, but certainly the previous 10 years and to some extent now, depending on where you are in the world, there are challenges in operating electric vehicles because of inability to access charging infrastructure where it's needed. And so the idea is, though, that actually internal combustion engines may face some kind of similar challenge in the future. So, if you fast forward to a world where there's a declining number of internal combustion engine vehicles, as you have, EVs becoming dominant, that will lead obviously to a decline in the demand for gasoline and ultimately to the closure of gas stations, because they have a minimum, it's essentially, you may even still have them operating and you might have the EV chargers there. They may be providing other services as people are thinking about that all works, but there is a minimum quantity of gasoline that a station needs to sell, basically because the gasoline itself can only sit in these tanks for so long, and there is a minimum quantity of delivery of gasoline that is sort of effective. So at a certain point of declining demand, gasoline stations will start to close. And so the question that we're interested in answering is, what does this decline look like, and how does the closure of gasoline stations potentially impact the operability of internal combustion engine vehicles? And so in order to do so, we're looking at the personal vehicle trips in Alberta on the basis of a data set that describes where people drive, and then a second piece, which is the gasoline station locations in Alberta. And by looking at the distance to the station from each trip, and understanding how that distance changes over time. So basically, as you start to remove gas stations from the infrastructure, from the gas station fleet, how does that distance change? Those removals have many factors that drive them in terms of the age of the station, but also commercial questions. So we're looking at sort of basically different patterns for removal of those stations, and then trying to answer, what percentage does this constrain electric or internal combustion vehicle operation, both in metrics of, obviously you can still operate a vehicle if you have to drive 20 kilometers to get to the gas station, but it does change the sort of it changes how convenient it is to operate. And then also wanting to understand, are these impacts different for different regions? Can you have actually rural regions that become somewhat cut off? Does it impact certain suburbs more than others? So that's what we're hoping to understand through this, which then again, I think ties back to some of the policy questions of, depending on what this contraction might look like, and the group of people that, is predominantly going to end up holding this asset, these older internal combustion engine vehicles, is going to be potentially a group of people that are least able to absorb the cost of the stranded assets. What is the role for government eventually there? Is it a role of actually purchasing some of those stranded assets? Are there things, is there planning that needs to be done ahead of time to understand how to deal with that as there is the potential for the contraction of that infrastructure?